Welcome to the deep dive. It is, it's incredibly good to have you sitting right here at the table with us today.
Absolutely.
We are looking at a deeply evocative slice of history today. It's centered around a man named Nicholas, and, well, perhaps more vividly, his tight-knit circle. Specifically, this brilliant but intensely erratic composer named Hugh Moreland.
Right.
We are dropping you right into the thick of 1930s London, and our mission today is to uncover exactly how art, romance, and politics violently and beautifully collided in this highly specific, incredibly vibrant social circle.
It's a world where, penniless bohemian musicians casually rub shoulders with immensely wealthy aristocrats, and where the rumblings of global conflict just form this constant backdrop to the most intensely personal dramas.
Exactly. To start us off, I really want to plant you directly into the environment. So imagine you were standing on a street corner in Soho during the aftermath of the Blitz. You're looking at a bombed-out public house. A direct hit has completely excised the ground floor.
Just totally gone.
Gone. What is left of the basement is revealed as this surreal sunken garden. It looks more like an abandoned archaeological excavation than a modern city. You've got great sprays of willow herb and ragwort flowering wildly through cracked paving stones. There are broken milk bottles, a laceless boot just lying there, ghostly reminders of the mundane life that used to happen in this space. And right in the middle of this somber grotto, 5 or 6 fractured steps have somehow withstood the explosion.
Like an island.
Yes, an island of masonry, and at the summit of those steps, a door frame still stands. The walls on both sides are completely shrunk away, but along the lintel of the door, in this niggling, almost fussy copybook handwriting, you can still distinguish the word ladies.
It's such a striking image.
It looks like a triumphal arch erected by dwarfs, or a gateway to some forbidden ruined domain. And then out of nowhere from this unexplored, desolate country comes a song. It's strong, marvelously sweet. It's a blonde woman on crutches, gliding down the middle of the empty street, singing the Kashmiri love song, "Pale hands I loved beside the Shalimar."
What's fascinating here is how this incredibly vivid, almost hallucinatory image of ruin and survival acts as a massive psychological trigger.
Yeah.
This ruined pub wasn't just any building. It was once the Mortimer, the very place where Nicholas and Moreland first met and where their friendship truly began.
Right.
And the blonde singer echoing down the street, she's someone they used to listen to years ago in that very pub. So the physical, violent destruction of the building, juxtaposed with the fragile endurance of this woman's song, creates an absolute flood of memory.
It draws us right into it.
It does. It immediately sets the overarching theme for our entire discussion today. The relentless, unforgiving passage of time, the enduring nature of human connection, and the highly eccentric characters of London's bohemian underworld who used to inhabit these spaces before the world fundamentally fractured. The past is constantly, almost painfully bleeding into the present.
It is such a haunting way into the material. And to really understand this world, we had to deeply understand the cast of characters who used to haunt the Mortimer pub before the bombs fell.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's start with Hugh Moreland himself. Picture a musical prodigy, a composer, a conductor. He has this massive Beethoven-shaped head, but short, dark, curly hair that gives him the look of a slightly dissipated cherub.
That's the perfect description.
He was raised by his aunt in Fulham, steeped from childhood in a tradition of hearing famous musicians discussed on familiar, everyday terms. But here's the crux of Moreland's character. He is an absolute, hopeless romantic, but in the most spectacularly impractical way possible.
Spectacularly impractical is almost an understatement.
Truly. For instance, he takes a gold cigarette case, a lavish gift from an immensely wealthy patron, the industrialist Sir Magnus Donners, and he pawns it.
Right.
Why? Just so he can scrape together the cash to take a chorus girl out for glamorous dinner at the Savoy. And the tragic-comic punchline to this grand romantic gesture.
She has a headache.
She happens to have a headache. The date fizzles out immediately, and the entirety of the remaining pawn money goes to paying for a miserable silent taxi ride to take her all the way back to her home in Golders Green.
It perfectly encapsulates Moreland's innate self-defeating romanticism. He suffers from what he self-diagnoses as a Princess Lointain complex, the eternal yearning for the distant, unattainable princess. He is perpetually falling in love with women connected to the theater, constantly casting himself in the role of the tragic stage door Johnny. And what is so striking is that his formidable intellect, his sharp wit, his undeniable musical genius, absolutely none of it helps him solve his emotional or logistical problems.
None of it.
In fact, his tendency to endlessly over-intellectualize, to persist eternally with trivial, abstract subjects just because they catch his philosophical fancy, acts as a massive hindrance. He is brilliant at scoring a symphony, but emotionally, he is constantly navigating a labyrinth entirely of his own making. He's unable to get out of his own way.
I see that entirely. He overthinks the execution to the point of paralysis.
Right.
But contrast him with his close friend, Barnaby. Barnaby is a painter, and his approach to life, and specifically to women, is entirely uncomplicated.
Night and day difference.
Exactly. There is no agonizing over the theoretical physics of romance, which Moreland refers to as the problem of time and space. Wait, I need to pause you there before we go further.
Yeah.
What exactly does Moreland mean when he constantly complains about time and space in this context? Because it sounds like he's trying to solve a quantum mechanics equation, not ask a woman out on a date.
That is exactly his problem. He intellectualizes the sheer logistics of romance to a paralyzing degree. For Moreland, time and space refers to the impossible logistical nightmare of getting a girl into a favorable scenario.
I see.
Yeah, like, where do you meet? How do you isolate her from her friends? Where do you go that is quiet but not overly intimate, cheap enough to afford but impressive enough to matter?
The logistics.
Right. How do you transition from a public dinner to a private setting without it feeling forced? For a theoretical thinker like Moreland, these practical variables multiply into an insurmountable equation. He sees the matrix of infinite possibilities and freezes. Barnaby, on the other hand, doesn't see a matrix. He just sees a woman he wants to paint, and by extension, get to know.
All right, Barnaby just operates. We will get to a perfect, almost surgical example of Barnaby in action in a moment. But to round out the core Mortimer crew, we have to look at Mr. Deacon.
Oh, Mr. Deacon.
Picture this man. He is ostensibly an antique dealer, but he looks like a mildly sinister medieval pilgrim. He has this whitening hair hanging over a coarse woolen muffler. He insists on wearing dark blue felt snow boots to protect himself against London puddles.
Snow boots?
Yes, the snow boots. And he constantly exudes the sharp medicinal smell of eucalyptus because he is pathologically obsessed with his own health. He's a vocal pacifist who stands outside the Albert Hall selling broadsheets titled "War Never Pays."
But simultaneously, he has a penchant for buying up classical, slightly dubious statuettes and mingling closely with the criminal underworld.
Exactly.
Mr. Deacon is a phenomenal, deeply contradictory character study. He represents an older, fading generation of bohemianism. It is a specific type of bohemianism that is inherently disreputable and anti-establishment, yet desperately, tragically clings to the fringes of high society. He loves nothing more than casually dropping names like Lady Huntercombe to prove his pedigree, while simultaneously professing revolutionary, anti-capitalist political views. It is the hypocrisy of the bohemian who ultimately still craves aristocratic validation. And sitting right next to him, usually radiating a palpable wave of disapproval, is McClintock.
Oh, we absolutely cannot forget McClintock.
McClintock is a music critic, and physically, he is bizarre. He is broad-shouldered but narrows drastically toward his lower extremities, which gives him the precarious appearance of a large triangular kite about to float away, propelled entirely on the fumes of Irish whiskey.
A kite on whiskey fumes.
Exactly. He wears minute, circular, gold-rimmed spectacles that make him look like a profoundly bad-tempered Victorian doctor. He is deeply, almost touchingly devoted to Moreland, acting almost protective of him in a rough way. But fundamentally, McClintock is grumpy, deeply pessimistic, and openly, aggressively despises women. He uses his gruff, intellectual combativeness to mask a violently imperfect integration of his own internal sentiments. He is a man at war with himself, projecting that war outward onto everyone else.
The dynamic between these drastically different men is incredible, and it is put on full glorious display when they decide to go out for dinner together. They end up at a place called Casanova's Chinese restaurant.
The name alone.
Now, the name alone is amazing, but the setting is crucial. It used to be an Italian joint called the New Casanova, but it went into liquidation. A Chinese restaurant bought the lease, moved in their pots, pans, and chopsticks, but they didn't bother to change the decor.
Brilliant.
So you have this incredibly surreal atmosphere. A clientele of Chinese businessmen, Indian students, and Soho bohemians eating 8 treasure rice directly under faded pastel frescoes depicting the romantic conquests of Casanova, the great lover.
The jarring incongruity of the setting, the clash of East and West, of cheap noodles and grandiose European romantic myth, is the perfect ironic backdrop for the conversation they dive into. Sitting under these terrible, peeling frescoes of Casanova, this specific group of men who, as we've established, all struggle spectacularly with their romantic lives in various ways, engage in a deep philosophical debate about the nature of legendary seducers. Specifically, they start dissecting the fundamental psychological difference between Don Juan and Casanova.
Yes, and this debate is so revealing of their own character flaws. Moreland argues passionately that Don Juan was driven purely by a cold, calculating love of power. He argues that Don Juan didn't actually know what true sensuality was, and if he did know it, he hated it.
Right.
He used women to conquer them, to assert dominance. Casanova, on the other hand, Moreland argues, was driven by genuine, albeit highly fleeting, sensual enjoyment. Moreland says the defining genius characteristic of Casanova wasn't the sheer volume of women he had. It was the fact that, despite the repetition, he never actually got bored. He retained his capacity for wonder.
It is a profound psychological distinction to make. It highlights the vast gulf between romantic conquest as a cynical exercise in ego and control, the Don Juan model, versus romantic conquest as a genuine, if serial, appreciation of the other person, the Casanova model. McClintock, true to his pessimistic form, entirely dismisses Casanova. He calls him an egotistical bore, claiming that professional seducers have to rely on sheer banality because genuine intelligence frightens people off. McClintock argues that seduction requires a lowering of the intellect.
Interesting.
Moreland counters this by pointing out a harsh truth. If you want to appeal to the vast majority of humanity, you have to find the lowest common denominator, which naturally and inevitably involves speaking in comfortable cliches.
Let me push back on that a bit, though.
Yeah.
Is it really just about power for Don Juan, or is there something else there? And isn't Moreland's defense of Casanova just a way of justifying his own tendency to fall fleetingly in love with every chorus girl he meets? He is validating his own lack of focus by calling it appreciation.
That is precisely what he is doing. Moreland uses high philosophy to excuse his own messy, chaotic, emotional life.
Yeah.
By elevating Casanova's serial infatuations to a state of unbored sensuality, he is essentially arguing that his own constant, agonizing crushes are a sign of artistic vitality rather than just terrible boundary management. He is intellectualizing his own flaws to avoid fixing them.
And while Moreland and McClintock are having this high-minded, fiercely theoretical debate about the metaphysics of romance, Barnaby is doing something entirely different. He is silently, intently observing the waitress, Norma.
Classic Barnaby.
Norma is described as tall, thin, very fair, with a blue-eyed childlike innocence that Barnaby notes makes her look like a very expensive, rather wicked little doll. Barnaby doesn't engage in the debate about Don Juan. He doesn't theorize.
No.
When Norma comes to the table to settle the bill, Barnaby simply speaks to her in a quiet, exaggeratedly gentle voice. He doesn't offer a grand romantic gesture. He tells her he is an artist, and he simply asks her if she would be willing to sit for a portrait.
And it works seamlessly. It is practically surgical. Norma plays hard to get for a brief moment, casually rejecting Sunday and Saturday as options, but she eventually agrees to a Thursday.
Right.
Barnaby scribbles his studio address on an envelope. Then, in a brilliant tactical shift, casually changes his mind and says he will just pick her up at the restaurant instead. It is a masterclass in practical operation.
Total masterclass.
While Moreland exhausts his emotional energy just trying to conceptually bridge the gap between time and space, Barnaby simply leverages his built-in structural advantages. As Moreland bitterly points out later, Barnaby has a studio, he controls his own working hours, and being a painter, he has a perfectly respectable professional motive for inviting a woman into his private space.
I understand Barnaby's practical advantage here, the built-in excuse of the studio. But if it is so obviously, undeniably successful, why doesn't a genius like Moreland just copy him? Is Moreland intentionally self-sabotaging?
He isn't intentionally self-sabotaging. It is just that genius in one domain often creates total paralysis in another. Moreland's brain is wired for complexity. He writes symphonies. He harmonizes dozens of instruments. So when he looks at a social interaction, he naturally harmonizes all the potential psychological variables, the social risks, the existential dread of rejection. He overcomplicates it because his brain only knows how to do complex work. Barnaby looks at the same situation and sees a simple, straight line.
That is a brilliant way to look at it. And it really makes you think about your own approach, doesn't it? I mean, if for you listening right now, when it comes to navigating complex relationships or even just going after what you want in life, do you find yourself acting like a Moreland, overthinking the grand theoretical philosophy of it all, getting tangled up in the logistical time and space until you're paralyzed? Or do you operate like a Barnaby, recognizing your tangible, practical advantages and executing a straightforward, simple plan. It is the eternal, agonizing battle between the theorist and the practitioner.
Precisely. And Moreland's intensely theoretical, paralyzing approach makes his next major life event all the more shocking to his entire social circle. Out of nowhere, this man who is constantly paralyzed by romantic indecision, who pawns cigarette cases for failed dates, announces casually that he's going to get married.
Right. And he doesn't even say who it is at first. He plays it incredibly close to the vest. He just invites Nicholas to an obscure, off-the-beaten-path production of a deeply dark John Webster play, The Duchess of Malfi.
Yeah.
The object of his sudden, decisive affection turns out to be an actress in the play named Matilda Wilson, and the physical description of her is very specific. She is described not as conventionally beautiful, but as a jolly lady.
A jolly lady. It is a vital term to understand her power. It translates to an unconventional beauty. It usually implies a woman whose individual physical features might be considered plain, severe, or even coarse by traditional societal standards, but whose overall presentation, striking intelligence, and sheer self-control create an undeniable magnetic attractiveness. She is tall and thin, with fairish hair and sleepy green eyes. The upper half of her face is delicate and pretty, but the lower half is forcefully, almost brutally modeled. You get the immediate sense that her physical presence and her allure are a direct manufactured result of her formidable willpower, rather than genetic luck.
Her backstory is just as fascinating, if not more so, than her look. She wasn't born into this glamorous theatrical world, and she certainly wasn't born into high society. Originally, her name was Betty Updike.
Betty Updike?
Yeah, Betty Updike. She was a chemist's daughter from a sleepy country town. Her big life-altering break came when she was helping her local school's dramatic society with a modest production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. This production happened to be staged at a place called Stourwater Castle.
Right.
She was literally on her knees, dressing little girls up as forest elves, when she was spotted by the owner of the castle, the immensely wealthy, powerful industrialist Sir Magnus Donners. She eventually became his mistress, which is exactly how she entered London's high society and subsequently the theatrical world.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a profound narrative of patronage, capital, and social mobility. Sir Magnus Donners represents the immense, almost feudal power of industrial wealth. He can pluck a chemist's daughter from obscurity and install her in the upper echelons of London society simply by decree.
Yeah.
But what is crucial is that by the time Moreland meets her, she has deliberately moved on from Sir Magnus. She has secured her independence, but she has acutely retained the poise, the social education, and the sheer confidence from that time. The transition of Matilda from being a wildly rich industrialist's mistress to becoming a bohemian composer's wife is culturally significant.
How so?
It represents a shift from being a wealthy man's aesthetic possession to becoming an artist's grounding, practical anchor. This shift becomes very apparent when Nicholas and Moreland go backstage after the intense performance of The Duchess of Malfi.
Let's really look at this backstage scene, because the contrast of characters is incredibly cinematic. You have these narrow, grimy, theatrical passages absolutely filled with little young men who had just danced the mask of madmen on stage. They're running around chaotic, undressing, chattering, washing off grease paint.
Pure chaos.
Pure chaos. Then you get to Matilda's dressing room. She's calmly sitting there, taking off her makeup.
Yeah.
And sitting casually on a stool next to her is Norman Chandler. Chandler played the sinister, violent role of Bolsola in the play, but offstage, he is this sprightly, adaptable, slightly androgynous former chorus boy.
Yeah.
And what is he doing amidst all this post-show chaos? He is lounging in a mauve dressing gown made of simulated brocade, casually reading a dense, heavy philosophical book called Time and Western Man.
The visual of Chandler in a mauve brocade gown reading Time and Western Man is deeply ironic and wildly insightful. Time and Western Man is a notoriously dense critique of modernism and romanticism written by Wyndham Lewis. It attacks the very bohemian romantic ideals that Moreland worships. For a sprightly former chorus boy to be casually flipping through it backstage shows that Chandler is highly performative with his intellect and also incredibly adaptable. He bridges multiple social worlds, he acts, he dances, he plays the saxophone, he reads heavy philosophy, he survives by being exactly what the room requires him to be. And his supreme adaptability is highlighted perfectly when a major commotion occurs in the hallway outside the dressing room. A woman arrives demanding to see him. It is Mrs. Fox.
And Mrs. Fox is no ordinary backstage fan looking for an autograph. She is a hugely wealthy, dominating aristocratic woman. She's actually the mother of Nicholas's old school friend, Charles Stringham. We are told she is beautiful, seemingly untouched by time, and entirely used to commanding rooms and being implicitly obeyed without question.
This interaction between Mrs. Fox and Norman Chandler is a brilliant, microscopic study in the total inversion of traditional power dynamics. Think about the structure of society at this time. Here is Mrs. Fox, an aristocrat with immense generational wealth and unquestionable social standing. And yet she is reduced to standing in a drafty, grimy, theatrical hallway, humbly begging this young, scruffy, adaptable actor to join her exclusive party for supper. She says, in this pleading tone, "Such an adventure for us, you know. It'd be so nice if you could come." And Chandler, he doesn't jump at the opportunity. He plays exceedingly hard to get.
He absolutely does. He adopts this slightly deferential but highly resistant tone. He tells her, oh, he is so sorry, but he's supposed to be meeting an old friend, Max Pilgrim, a cabaret singer. And Mrs. Fox is so desperate for Chandler's specific trendy company that she immediately concedes.
She caves instantly.
Instantly. She insists that Max Pilgrim must come too. She begs Chandler to telephone him at once and invite him along. Chandler ultimately agrees, but you can see clearly that he holds all the cards in this specific interaction. Mrs. Fox is utterly captivated by his youth, his artistic aura, his indifference.
Moreland observes this whole dynamic play out and makes a very astute, if slightly cynical, psychological point. He notes that fundamentally, everyone likes being fallen in love with, and those who pretend they don't are usually the ones who secretly wring the most sadistic pleasure out of the experience.
Oof. Yeah.
Chandler is deeply enjoying the attention, the luxury, the ritzy life that Mrs. Fox can provide. But by feigning reluctance, he maintains his own independence and maximizes her desperation. He understands the transactional nature of his charm.
While Chandler is expertly managing high society in the hallway, we get to see exactly how Matilda manages Moreland inside the dressing room. As we establish, Moreland is notoriously difficult and paralyzed when it comes to practical decisions. A restaurant menu is a nightmare of time and space for him.
Not a nightmare.
But Matilda handles him with brilliant efficiency. When they go out to eat after the play, instead of letting him agonize over the choices and ruin the mood, she simply orders for him. She says, "If Meyerbeer, you always enjoy them." And Moreland just accepts it happily.
That small, seemingly mundane detail is exactly why their relationship works, at least initially. First, Yves Meyerbeer is not a simple dish. It is a rich, highly complex, somewhat absurd dish of eggs served with lamb kidneys and a heavy truffle sauce.
Wow.
Yeah. It perfectly aligns with Moreland's rich, impractical, slightly overly dramatic tastes. But by ordering it for him, Matilda removes the agonizing paralysis of choice. She provides the decisive, grounding force that his chaotic genius desperately lacks. She is intelligent enough to debate the nuances of John Webster and Christopher Marlowe with him, but relentlessly practical enough to make sure the man actually eats his dinner.
Right.
She manages his eccentricities without stifling his artistic aura. It is no wonder a man like Moreland, exhausted by his own mind, ends up marrying her shortly after this at a quiet registry office.
It makes total sense. She is the anchor to his balloon. So we have thoroughly explored the bohemian underworld, the gritty reality of the theater, and the edges of high society patronage. Now, we are going to shift our focus to a completely different, much more insulated environment. We move out of Soho and into the sedate, melancholic, deeply upper-class world of Hyde Park Gardens, specifically to a Sunday luncheon hosted by Lady Warminster, the formidable matriarch of the Tolland family.
Right. Nicholas is actually married into this sprawling aristocratic family. He recently wed one of the daughters, Isabel Tolland.
Exactly.
The atmosphere at Hyde Park Gardens is a jarring, stark contrast to the chaotic, gin-soaked vibrancy of the Mortimer pub or the frenetic energy backstage at the theater. It is described as quiet, almost suffocatingly despondent. It is a world of immense, quiet privilege, but also a world suffering from a certain emotional and cultural stagnation. The aristocracy is holding its breath. Lady Warminster herself is a fascinating, somewhat terrifying matriarchal figure. She spends her days writing dense, unread biographies of Amazonian historical women, like Maria Theresa, and she glides through her massive house like a patrician sibyl about to announce a calamitous disaster. She projects power, but it is a static, historical power.
And the Tolland siblings sitting around the table are quite a bunch. You have Blanche, who is described as slightly dotty. She floats through life like a sleepwalker, detached from reality, and has proudly just spent 5 solid months finishing a massive jigsaw puzzle of Venice.
5 months.
5 months. You have George, the immaculate, perfectly tailored former guardsman who now works in the financial sector in the city. But the overarching dominant topic of conversation at this particular luncheon is the eldest brother, Erridge, who holds the title of Lord Warminster.
Erridge is the ultimate family eccentric, a trope of the era, the aristocratic rebel. He is a wealthy peer of the realm, owning massive estates, but he chooses to live in tattered, unwashed clothes, harbors intense left-wing political views, and generally avoids all the traditional responsibilities of his estate, Thrubworth.
Right.
He is constantly seeking a cause to validate his existence outside of his unearned title. He recently ran off to China with a woman named Mona, who, complicatedly, used to be married to one of Nicholas's friends and then lived with an aggressive, opportunistic, left-wing writer named J.G. Quidgen. That chaotic relationship fell apart and Erridge has returned. But the big news dropping at the luncheon is his next grand move. Erridge has announced he is heading to Spain to actively involve himself in the Spanish Civil War.
Now, listener, this is where we have to pause and set the framework. The conversation at this luncheon naturally turns into a fierce political debate regarding the Spanish Civil War. To understand the 1930s, you have to understand that this conflict was the ideological crucible of the decade. We are going to impartially lay out the specific viewpoints expressed by these historical figures. We are strictly reporting the sociological and historical stances as they are documented in the material without taking any sides or endorsing any of the views presented. Our mission here is simply to show how this massive global conflict impacted and divided this specific social circle and what those divisions say about their personal psychologies.
Exactly. The dining table at Hyde Park Gardens becomes a perfect microcosm of the fractured, highly polarized political opinions of the 1930s British establishment. First, we have St. John Clarke. He is an aging, somewhat pompous, formerly successful novelist who has recently, and very publicly, aligned himself with the extreme left. Why? Partly out of genuine conviction, but largely to stay relevant and fashionable with the younger, radical intellectuals who dictate literary tastes. St. John Clarke passionately supports the democratically elected Spanish Republican government. He speaks glowingly of looking forward to a social revolution in a country that he claims has remained oppressively feudal for far too long. He adopts the posture of the revolutionary intellectual.
Then sitting across from him, you have George Tolland. George takes a highly cynical, deeply pragmatic view. As a former military man, now working in the city's financial district, he represents the mercantile, practical, upper-middle class. George states, frankly, without any romanticism, that he expects General Franco's nationalist forces to win.
Right.
George expresses a deep pragmatic distaste for both ideological extremes. He strongly dislikes the fascists, but he equally dislikes the Soviet-backed communists who are supporting the government side. He looks at the conflict not as a romantic struggle for the soul of Europe, but as a destructive mess with no good outcome for British interests. He defaults to a cynical neutrality.
Finally, we have Roddy Cutts, who is a member of parliament and married to one of the Tollands sisters. Roddy delivers a very measured, classic, tightrope-walking politician's argument. He suggests that while the internal administration of Spain had undeniably broken down into chaos, one has to seriously question whether that administrative breakdown legally or morally justified a military coup d'etat.
Yeah.
He advocates a careful position. He argues against encouraging a fascist military adventurer while simultaneously expressing a zero sympathy for government factions that allow a country to slide into lawlessness, property destruction, and potential communist control. He is trying to thread the needle of establishment stability.
It is a remarkably tense discussion, with everyone essentially using the bloody war in Spain to project their own internal worldviews and anxieties about the future of Britain. But beneath the high-minded political debate, there is some incredibly petty, serious social maneuvering going on. You mentioned St. John Clarke, the aging novelist playing the revolutionary. He is actually at this luncheon with a very specific ulterior motive.
Yes, his presence is entirely transactional. St. John Clarke is using Erridge's dramatic departure for Spain to ingratiate himself with the powerful matriarch, Lady Warminster. After the luncheon, he pulls her aside into a corner and essentially asks to be her primary confidant regarding Erridge's complex business affairs while Erridge is away playing revolutionary. He claims, rather dubiously, that Erridge specifically asked him to look after his politico-literary interests.
But why is he doing this? He's an aging novelist. Why does he care about Erridge's estate management?
It is a calculated power play. St. John Clarke wants to secure his direct influence over the immensely wealthy, easily swayed Lord Warminster. But more importantly, he desperately wants to edge out his younger, much more aggressive rival, J.G. Quidgen. Quidgen is a genuinely working-class, hard-line left-wing writer who has been successfully living off Arridge's patronage and living in Arridge's house. By getting Lady Warminster's ear, St. John Clark hopes to bypass Quidgen entirely, cut off his access, and cement his own position as the chief intellectual advisor within the family's inner circle. It is a brilliant, cynical example of how grand, tragic political crises are so often utilized by individuals for petty, personal social claiming and score settling.
That is such a sharp analysis of human nature. People will use a war to win a localized argument. And that exact theme, using massive external events to mask or manipulate internal, deeply personal struggles, brings us to the next much darker section of our deep dive, which deals with the grim physical realities of marriage and health.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. We move from the theoretical debates of the drawing room to the sterile reality of a hospital. Nicholas's wife, Isabel, is in a nursing home recovering from the physical and emotional trauma of a miscarriage. While visiting her, Nicholas bumps into his old friend Moreland wandering the hallway. Moreland is there because his wife, Matilda, is also a patient. She was pregnant, but tragically, her baby survived only a few agonizing hours after birth.
It is a profoundly somber, stripped-down moment. Two close friends suddenly meeting in the sterile, disinfectant-smelling corridors of a medical facility, both dealing simultaneously with the devastating loss of a child and the precarious, fragile health of their wives. Moreland, who is usually so verbose, so quick to theorize and philosophize, is deeply, genuinely dejected. He is pacing the halls, visibly overwhelmed by the sudden, brutal physical fragility of life and the heavy, inescapable responsibilities of marriage that he can no longer intellectualize away. The time and space problem has been replaced by stark mortality.
But life doesn't pause for grief, and the somber mood in the hallway is shattered by a comedic, almost absurdly jarring interruption. Down the corridor comes Dr. Brandreth, and waddling alongside him is a man named Kenneth Widmerpool. If you want a clear picture of Widmerpool, imagine a stout, heavy-breathing man dressed in a grubby, aggressively unglamorous, gray and blue striped pajama suit, completely enveloped by a heavy, practical Jaeger dressing gown.
Such an image.
He is a highly ambitious city businessman, and he is currently recovering from a painful bout of boils. He pushes past Nicholas and Moreland without any ceremony or spatial awareness, acting intensely annoyed as if they were taking up too much room in his personal passage.
Widmerpool is the absolute terrifying antithesis of Moreland. Where Moreland is romantic, artistic, and paralyzed by nuance, Widmerpool is entirely self-important, completely devoid of humor, and ruthlessly clinical.
Yeah.
When Dr. Brandreth attempts to politely introduce Moreland to Widmerpool as one of England's most promising young musicians, Widmerpool's reaction is completely dismissive. He doesn't care about the arts. If an industry or a person cannot be quantified or utilized for his own advancement, it holds zero value for him. He barely acknowledges Moreland's existence. He focuses solely on Nicholas, whom he knows from their school days, and even then, his conversation is purely transactional, boastful, and self-centered. He is agog to get back to his desk in the city. For Widmerpool, illness, grief, or human frailty are not existential tragedies. They are simply irritating, inefficient delays to his career trajectory. He represents the terrifying rise of the pure technocrat.
Widmerpool treats his own health as just an annoying roadblock to his ambition. But for our Bohemian crew, a health crisis, or just a general suffocating depression of a hospital environment, requires an immediate, almost frantic escape. Which is exactly why Moreland, unable to sit with his grief, drags Nicholas out of the nursing home and insists they go straight into what might be the absolute worst domestic environment in all of London, the McClintock's house.
Oh, boy.
We're heading into Pimlico, into an area of the city described as a desolate, sinking region of decaying stucco streets.
Moreland genuinely believes that visiting McClintock, his grumpy, combative friend, will serve as a necessary distraction from the tragedy at the hospital. But stepping into the McClintock household is like stepping directly into a domestic hellscape. The house is objectively miserable. It is filthy, completely disorganized, and physically, bone-chillingly freezing.
And Mrs. McClintock. She opens the front door, and her formidable, toxic discontent sweeps across the threshold in literal scorching, blasting waves. She is practically vibrating with unspent resentment. She is furious about everything.
Everything.
She's furious that McClintock hasn't bothered to get the gas fire fixed, leaving them to freeze in the damp London winter. Yeah. She is furious that for 7 long years he has been agonizing over writing a massive, impenetrable tome on musical theory that she is absolutely convinced no publisher will ever touch and no sane person will ever read. And she doesn't hide this contempt. She openly, viciously mocks his life's work right in front of his friends.
The tension in that living room is suffocating. It is a masterclass in marital warfare. And adding a layer of bizarre, surreal comedy to the atmosphere is the constant presence of Carollo. Remember Carollo?
The violinist.
He was the child prodigy violinist we briefly met much earlier in the Mortimer pub. Well, he grew up, his career completely stalled, he is entirely broke, and he is now living with the McClintocks as a silent lodger.
Wow.
During this horrific, escalating marital tension, Carollo just sits silently at a small table in the corner of the room, calmly eating snacks and scoring music with a pencil, completely expertly ignoring the screaming matches happening just feet away from his head. He is the ultimate desensitized survivor of their crossfire.
It gets even worse. The McClintocks clearly need something fresh to fight about, a new angle of attack. So what massive topic do they choose to weaponize? The Spanish Civil War.
Exactly. Just like the wealthy aristocrats at the upper-class luncheon, the war enters the conversation in Pimlico. But here, in this freezing living room, the conflict is completely stripped of all its genuine geopolitical or moral meaning. McClintock, who naturally hates conformity and middle-class consensus, aggressively attacks the left.
Yeah.
Mrs. McClintock violently, passionately defends the Spanish Republican government, but it is abundantly clear to anyone watching she doesn't actually care about the politics of Spain. She supports the left purely, 100%, to spite her husband, and McClintock attacks her political views purely to belittle her intelligence in front of his peers.
It is brutal to witness. He mocks her mercilessly, sneering that she only takes the left-wing position because it is the fashionable, done thing for unoriginal middle-brow thinkers who just want to feel virtuous. She glares at him with pure, undiluted hatred, sharply questioning what a failed, unpublished critic could possibly know about the real world.
Yeah.
I mean, let's pause and think about the psychology of this. How often do we see this exact dynamic play out in real life?
All the time.
How often do couples, or even deeply fractured friend groups, use grand, abstract, global issues as a convenient proxy battleground for their own deeply personal, unspoken resentments? They aren't actually fighting about the fate of Madrid or Barcelona. They're fighting about the broken gas fire, the 7-year unwritten book, and the terrifying realization that they can no longer stand the sight of each other.
It is a devastating, highly accurate portrait of a marriage that has calcified into a prison. And witnessing this deeply unsettles Moreland. Think about Moreland's state of mind. He is a romantic who has just suffered the trauma of losing a child. He is already highly anxious about the newly discovered weight of his own marriage with Matilda, and now he is forced to sit in a freezing room watching two people systematically destroy each other over politics. Witnessing the McClintock's toxicity makes him profoundly question the fundamental viability of the institution of marriage altogether. It shatters his romantic illusions.
Despite the tragedy at the hospital and the profound anxiety triggered in Pimlico, life stubbornly moves forward. Time passes. Moreland finally, painstakingly finishes his grand symphony. The premiere is scheduled, but in a stroke of incredibly bad luck, its release coincides perfectly with a massive, all-consuming national distraction. The royal abdication crisis of King Edward VIII. Yes. Now, we need to contextualize this. The abdication wasn't just a news story. It was a constitutional earthquake. The king choosing to abdicate the throne to marry an American divorcee sucked absolutely all the oxygen out of British culture. Everyone in the country, from the pubs to the palaces, was obsessed with this drama. And Moreland correctly views this as incredibly bad timing for his big artistic debut.
The timing is disastrous for an artist seeking the spotlight. Nevertheless, the symphony performance goes ahead. And the reception. It is deemed a solid success. The critics like it, the audience applauds politely, but the psychological impact of this specific type of reception on Moreland is complex and somewhat agonizing.
How so?
For a highly ambitious romantic artist like Moreland, achieving a merely solid, respectable success can feel like a profound, soul-crushing anticlimax. He didn't want to be polite. He wanted to startle people. He wanted a detonation of brilliance, a controversial masterpiece that shifted the cultural paradigm. Instead, it was simply well-received. It lacks the shock value, the intense passion, or the heated controversy that validates a certain type of fragile creative ego. He is terrified of being just good.
After the concert, despite Moreland's internal disappointment, the wealthy Mrs. Fox throws a grand, opulent after-party to celebrate him at her massive house off Berkeley Square. The visual contrast in this scene is absolutely stunning. You have this sweeping crimson damask drawing room filled with heavy malachite urns and intimidating priceless portraits by Rondi staring down from the walls. And walking straight into this hyper-elite, pristine, aristocratic setting are the scruffy, exhausted Bohemian musicians. You have the McClintocks still visibly simmering with mutual hatred. Carlo, looking pale, greasy, and out of place. All of them awkwardly mingling with figures like Lord and Lady Huntercombe, who represent the absolute untouchable peak of high society arts patronage.
It is the ultimate, slightly uncomfortable collision of the two disparate worlds we have been tracking throughout this deep dive. The patrons and the subjects forced to make small talk. And amidst this glamorous, tense party, we get a very quiet, deeply poignant update on Mrs. Fox's son, Charles Stringham.
Yeah.
Stringham, who was once universally considered a brilliant, charming, golden boy figure of his generation, has completely succumbed to severe, debilitating alcoholism. He is not at the party. The whispers reveal he is now living under the strict, essentially custodial care of Miss Whedon, who was formerly his mother's humble secretary.
And it is heavily implied that Miss Whedon uses physical restraint-locking doors, controlling his movements, to keep him away from alcohol. The golden boy is essentially a prisoner in a suburban house.
Yes. The sheer tragedy of Stringham's fall is striking. Here is a man born to immense, incalculable privilege, possessing every natural advantage of wit and charm, now reduced to a captive existence. To occupy his shaking hands and empty days, he has turned to painting theatrical costumes in gouache. The image of the aristocratic heir painting colorful little stage costumes in a locked room stands in sharp, tragic contrast to the relentless ambition and social maneuvering of every other character we've discussed. It shows the decay of the old order.
Which brings us perfectly to the final scene in our source material, a coda that features none other than Kenneth Widmerpool, the technocrat in the Jaeger dressing gown. Nicholas meets Widmerpool for lunch at a very serious leather-bound club in the city. The national economy is finally recovering from a prolonged slump, and Widmerpool is practically vibrating with smug, aggressive satisfaction.
Of course he is.
He delivers this incredibly clinical, entirely emotionless analysis of the stock market to Nicholas. He happily calculates that while stock prices have risen a staggering 217%, corporate dividends have only reached about 64%.
For Widmerpool, the entire world is just a giant spreadsheet waiting to be optimized. He is entirely unbothered by the agonizing artistic struggles of a genius like Moreland or the tragic, quiet decline of an aristocrat like Stringham. During lunch, he casually, purposefully mentions that he is now moving in exalted circles. He heavily hints at having direct royal or near-royal connections during the abdication crisis.
Right.
He confidently anticipates what he calls a new broom that will inevitably sweep away the old, inefficient societal structures of the aristocracy and the Bohemians. He is actively positioning himself to inherit and manage whatever brutal new world emerges. Furthermore, he expresses a chilling, smug relief that a recent engagement to a woman named Mildred Haycock fell through. He doesn't view the broken engagement as an emotional loss. He views it purely as a successfully dodged financial and social liability.
So look at the incredible ground we have covered. We have traveled from the bombed-out, weed-choked ruins of the Mortimer pub, where penniless, passionate musicians dreamed of romance and art, through the freezing, miserable, toxic squalor of Pimlico, where marriages literally go to die, all the way to the malachite-filled drawing rooms of high society and the cold, calculating mahogany clubs of the financial district. We have seen brilliant artists paralyze themselves, ancient aristocrats fade into obsolescence, and ruthless operators begin their ascent, all trying to navigate this incredibly turbulent period of history.
And when you step back and look at this entire tapestry, it raises a vital, unavoidable question about human nature and societal evolution. Look at the stark contrast between a character like Hugh Moreland and a character like Kenneth Widmerpool. When the dust settles on an era, what type of person ultimately inherits the world? Is it the romantic tortured artists? The Morelands, who feel absolutely everything deeply, who perceive the infinite beauty of the world but are ultimately paralyzed by their own extreme sensibilities and logistical time and space problems? Or is it the Widmerpools, the cold, calculating, utterly humorless operators who view all of human life as a series of purely transactional power dynamics to be managed and exploited?
That is the perfect, chilling note to leave you on today. We have explored how these wildly different individuals attempt to navigate the intersecting minefields of love, art, and politics. But here is a final, highly provocative thought for you to mull over long after you take off your headphones. When the grand music of time finally stops playing and history writes the final account of an era, who does it actually remember and revere?
That's a great question.
Does history ultimately honor the passionate, messy, paralyzed creators who suffered endlessly for their art and their loves? Or does the future, in reality, belong entirely to the Widmerpools, the cold, calculating opportunists who never feel a thing, but who merely manage the ledgers, avoid the liabilities, and ruthlessly adapt to whatever new broom sweeps into absolute power? Think deeply about that the next time you find yourself trying to balance your own grand romantic ideals against the harsh, unforgiving practicalities of the real world. Are you building a symphony, or are you just managing the spreadsheet? Thank you so much for sitting at the table with us on this deep dive. It's been an incredibly wild, revealing journey through the psyche of 1930s London, and we truly hope you keep exploring these fascinating, complex layers of history entirely on your own. We will see you next time.